going to talk for a little bit, set some context on mindsets, and this particular one, love the problem that we're going to get into. If you do have questions, I will try to save some time at the end to get through as many questions as we have. So feel free to queue them up in the chat window. I can scan through those, or someone can help moderate. That would also ease things up. So that's just a bit of the logistic side of things. So I'll go ahead and jump into the topic for today. So why are we talking about mindsets? I found both for myself and with other teams that we work with and have had the privilege of working with over the last several years, that what separates success today is less about skill sets. We have gotten pretty good at building products, but the bigger question is really challenging your go-to-market strategy, challenging the mindsets or worldview that you use to kind of make sense of what customers want, how you launch, and all of those types of things. And so I'm actually going to start off setting some context with a story that I built up by studying many entrepreneur teams that we had a chance to work with. And I call them Steve and Larry, not because I wanted to be necessarily gender specific, but I wanted to really tell the story of two very similar looking entrepreneurs that start out much the same way, but maybe don't end up in the same place. So I have a longer blog post, you can check that out. And the persona here, like as I said, is not one that is tied to geography or gender. What I found over the last decade or so is that entrepreneurs are everywhere, look very different, come from all walks of life. So we're not just two guys in the garage in Silicon Valley. It really is a much bigger persona of what an entrepreneur might look like. So with that out of the way, the reason I picked this is that we have two entrepreneurs here, calling them Steve and Larry. They both get hit with an idea, but when we follow up with them a year later, we see they end up in very different places. So Steve is still building his product. He doesn't have revenue. He's working alone. Larry, on the other hand, has growing customer base, build product, growing team. And so the big question here is what separates these two types of teams or these two types of entrepreneurs. And so if we go back in the story, about a year ago, Steve, yes, gets hit with this idea, but the mindset or the playbook that he employs is a build first approach. And we've all been there. This is where we start tinkering in the garage. We first break into the piggy bank and decide we're going to break into our savings and build a solution or build this product that we have in mind. Everything looks pretty rosy in the beginning, but at some point we start looking like this. Things always take a bit longer than we expect. We expect a product to take 2 months or 3 months to be built, but we realize that we are maybe only half finished at that point. It's 6 months later now, and Steve is starting to look more like this. So doesn't have a finished product. He decides he needs to go and get some help. He shows his half-finished product, which you can tell looks like a half-finished rocket ship, to some of his co-founders or potential co-founders, and nobody sees what he sees. And that's something to kind of internalize or to recognize, is that when you actually show a product, what you see is not what others see. And oftentimes when it's a half-finished product, it's even harder thing to get across. So nobody sees what he sees. So Steve, of course, gets upset, but he casts it as lack of vision. His friends just don't have the vision to see what he has. So of course, he's just going to go and work harder and show them up. But he also realizes that he needs, at this point, funds. Maybe he can hire people to come help him finish the product. And so he goes down the investment or pitching circuit. So he talks to some advisors, and the advice he gets is go and pitch your business plan. Go and pitch your idea to investors, but make sure you've got a solid business plan first. And so Steve then stops building product and spends the next several weeks, which quickly turn into months, trying to put out a pitch deck or trying to put out the beginnings of a business plan. And anyone who has gone through this process knows that it can be rather elaborate. It's a bit of a rabbit hole that you go down. So you start building forecasts and pitches, market analysis, MVPs. A lot of this is rather fictional, but you need to have something that is solid. So Steve spends quite a bit of time away from product trying to do these kinds of things. He then eventually gets introductions to some investors, pitches his idea, doesn't get an outright rejection, but if you notice, what he gets is what we sometimes call the polite no. Great idea, but you're too early for us. That is just code for you have built something, but you don't yet have customers. But oftentimes we first-time entrepreneurs don't quite understand how to read that code. And so Steve goes off and realizes that he has a catch-22 situation. He is in a place where he has a half-finished product. No one wants to help him finish it because they're not as visionary as he is, not able to see this finished product. And on the other side, he's having a tough time with investors because they too want to see something that he can deliver until he finishes his product. So it feels a lot like a catch-22. And I saw a lot of teams over the last several years take this path and then get stuck. So where do you go from here? How do you really navigate forward? So that's how Steve ends up looking like this a year from now. So still building product, no product revenue, works alone. If we contrast the Larry story, on the other hand, he starts with a very different playbook. So the thing that he realizes is he too has an idea, he too has something he wants to bring to market. But the thing he quickly realizes, because he has been down this path one too many times, is that a build first or an investor first approach is just backwards. It's backwards, especially today, because as I mentioned in the opening, a lot of us are decently good at building product. The bigger question is, are we building the right product? Can you show evidence that people other than yourself, your team, your mom care about this idea? And that's what gets more customers. That's what gets more investors to pay attention to you. So essentially this notion of a new world. So we are living in this new world. In the old world, there was a time where you had to do the Steve approach. You had to go and de-risk a solution because building product was hard, it was expensive, IP was important, and those things are still important today, but it's a much flatter world from a product development sense. So there also were fewer startups, fewer competition, and so you didn't really have as much competition. If you build even the wrong product, you could try again and eventually try to get it right. So if you go back 10, 20 years, a lot of startups started out this way. Today, though, it's for all these reasons, very different. We build a lot more products, a lot easier to build products. Customers, on the other hand, also have a lot more choices. For any idea out there, there are probably at a minimum 5 variants in play at any given time, and sometimes the number is way, way higher. And so when you as a customer get pitched, you can go and do a quick Google search and find many similar types of things. And that's the world we're living in today. So in the world that we're living in today, if you want to show evidence that your idea works, the only thing that ultimately matters is traction. Can you really show that evidence of people using your product, ideally using it, getting value, and your business model working, you getting paid directly or indirectly? When we look at the investment side of things, many investors today no longer value intellectual property alone. They still, of course, want to make sure that you pass the checklist, you can build and all those types of things. In some industries, intellectual property is more valued than others, but for many of the industries, it's less about can we build it, but rather should we build it and have we built something that people want? And it is these insights, it is this mindset that allows Larry to take a very different approach. So his big epiphany is my business model, not the solution, is the product. And so I need to focus in on that. So rather than working out an elaborate model, he sketches out, and some of you might know this tool, the Lean Canvas. He uses a simple model to sketch out his idea, not a very elaborate business plan that would be fictional. He instead decides to use a small, lightweight model. He does some quick back of the envelope calculations to figure out how much traction he needs to show to get the attention of an investor or get the attention of a co-founder or get the attention of customers. And he basically gets to work. So he starts with a very different approach, which isn't build first, but rather customer first. And the counterintuitive part here is that you can actually get customers without a product. And so I'll leave that for the questions. If some of you are doubtful about how you do this, we can walk through that process in a bit more detail. But this is a little bit of a preview of that. The thing he realizes is that in order to get a customer, the most important thing is getting their attention. What can you tell a customer that is different? And does that different matter to your customers? That's what the beginnings of a unique value proposition looks like. Not just a value proposition, but a unique value proposition. The job of a startup is to stand out. And that is the thing that he decides to go and test. The way you do this is by going through a systematic approach. And you can, of course, go through this with a big bang approach, launch something and see if it works. But a systematic approach helps you measure and learn along the way. And so he spends the first 4 weeks doing nothing with the product, but just learning from customers. He's trying to figure out which customers to go after, what problems to really solve, what possible solutions could he possibly build. And this is a discovery process. And there are a lot of techniques and tactics for doing this. I will share some of those today. He then spends the next 8 weeks beginning to formulate an offer. So not really building an MVP or a product, but really formulating a pitch or an offer of what it is that he could build. And so the insight here that he's acting on, or the process he's acting on, is not building a product then trying to sell it. He's trying to make a sale before he builds anything. So the old world approach is build something, demo that thing you built, and then make a sale. The new world approach that he's using is do some discovery work, then build a demo, not a full product. If you can't sell the demo, why build anything? So that's a bit of the process that he uses. And so after he does this for 8 weeks, he potentially gets traction or not. He doubles down on the segments that do work, and that's how he gets off to a much better footing. So he has pre-sold his product, and now he can focus on building the right product versus having to build something and then ask the question, is it right? So I go back to this counterintuitive maybe insight, which is you do not need to finish building a product in order to sell it. And actually, it's oftentimes even to your detriment if you go and show a half-finished product to a customer, because they look at it and say it's half-finished. When will you be finished? And that becomes their excuse for not buying. So you actually want to avoid those kinds of traps, and instead first focus in on the value proposition, then focus in on the demo. And if you can't sell the demo, don't bother building anything in those early stages. So that's kind of how this story plays out. And we go back to the statement from earlier, is the separation here is really in the way these two teams or these two entrepreneurs operate. One of them takes a build first approach because they are placing a lot of the risks in the business on the solution. They are trying to envision technical risk as being the thing that's going to make them succeed or stand out or win. While on the other hand, Larry takes a more customer-centric approach. Customers don't care about your solution. They only care about the things they want and the things that stand in the way that prevent them from getting the things they want. In other words, problems. And so that's a very different mindset that you see with the second story. And that's what we'll talk about here. So this was a bit of an intro on what those mindsets tend to look like. If I stay on this slide, we can use different labels. I use the artist label. Sometimes people get upset because I'm calling out artists, but really by the people on the left-hand side are really makers, artists, inventors, and everyone starts there. I used to be a Steve, and one day I realized that life was too short to keep building things that only I thought people wanted. I actually wanted to build things that they actually wanted. And so I transformed my thinking from not just building things and then testing them to see if people want it, but trying to figure out what people want, just flipping the order of steps. And that shifts your mindset from that artist mindset to inventor, from an inventor mindset to an innovator mindset. So let's talk a little bit about mindsets, and then we'll go into what these mindsets tend to look like. So what is a mindset? To me, it's really a collection of beliefs that shape your outcomes. And the way that this manifests itself is you start with a set of beliefs, and those beliefs drive your strategy. So you saw build first versus investor first versus traction first. Those strategy will define the actions you take or the tactics you use. So do you spend all your time chasing investors, or do you spend all your time chasing customers? You know, those are choices you can make. There are only 24 hours in the day, and you have to pick wisely. And those tactics will ultimately define your outcome. So I'm not saying that the old world approach that I showed here was always wrong. There was a time where that worked, and that was the playbook that people used, but the world is different today. And so when we have, so the other way to think of this is that the mindsets are our worldview, how we shape and make sense of the world. And we are living in a very different world. So for the first time in a long time, we have had a few things happen. And this is thanks to the internet and access to information. We don't have equal access, but near equal access to tools and knowledge. You can have somebody halfway across the world looking at this talk right now, which was something that would be unfathomable if we went back 15, 20 years. And that's what I mean by near equal access for tools and knowledge. Cheaper and faster today to build products, so we don't need to have expensive computers, expensive licenses, or all these things have become cheaper and faster to do. You can launch a business from anywhere. You don't have to move to Silicon Valley. You can do this from anywhere in the world. Customer relationships are going more direct. You see this in industry after industry. Look at Apple. They've always had a direct relationship with their customers. Even when they build phones, they don't go the traditional route. They find a direct path to their end users. You look at a company like Tesla, launch cars, don't go through dealers, go direct to consumers. That's where the value is created. So the quicker you can get to those end users and understand what is it that they want, the better products you can build. And we're seeing this in business after business, in segment after segment. The other thing that has become increasingly important is speed, not of execution, but speed of learning. If you're executing on a flawed plan, you can be going really fast, but you're just going to build something nobody wants. So you want to make sure that you are pivoting and iterating and getting on the right track, course correcting along the way, because when you're going really fast, there's a lot of uncertainty. You can't get it right out the gate. And so you have to take a more iterative approach. And the last one, I could not leave this one out, is we are living in a pandemic-ridden world, which has got its own challenges. And the thing to also recognize, and you can go and look this up later, is that whenever you find crisis moments, you find a lot more struggle. And I'll share with you a model for how you can bring this together when you're chasing problems. But when you've got struggle, you've got consumers who run into problems, which by definition for innovators create lots of opportunities for new solutions to come into existence. And historically, when we look at past crises, whether these are recessions or other kinds of black swan events, you have found a number of startups that have started in those times, and they have statistically had above average odds of succeeding. And you can again go and look at the stats on this. And that's just something to internalize, that even though we are living through a tough time, this is a time where there are going to be lots of redistribution of solutions, redistribution of how value gets created. So I'll come back to this maybe in the Q&A, because I'll share with you a model you can use to think through these kinds of switching events or these kinds of crisis events. But for now, we'll just focus in on mindset change, and we'll talk about what these mindsets look like. So when you have a new world, it naturally follows that you need to employ some new mindsets as well. So that was the case for why the mindsets matter. Now, there are 10 key mindsets that we have identified at LeanStack, where the company that I started, the company that I work in. I'm not going to obviously go through all 10 of these because we only have an hour, but I want to just list them out here. We'll make sure you get slides. I'll also reference a online resource that you can use if you want to dive deeper into them. What I do want to focus in on is how these mindsets are organized. So when we look at any idea, we want to break it down into this iterative approach. So much like in science, we don't just rush to run experiments. We don't just rush to execute on anything. We take an approach of starting with models, testing them, and then making course corrections along the way. That's what model prioritized test is. So this is essentially the scientific method adapted using lean startup types of principles and concepts for the entrepreneurship method, or what would be the equivalent of the entrepreneurial method. So much like a scientist, all of you should be thinking of a business model, because models help you understand complex behaviors. Businesses are complex. And so thinking of simple models like a lean canvas or the business model canvas are helpful in beginning to estimate or beginning to think through what is it that customers want. If you're familiar with the lean canvas, I'll have a picture here shortly. You can begin to tell the story of who your customers are, what problems you solve, what you do to solve them, how you go to market, how you charge money. So it's just a simple way of doing that kind of storytelling. The next step here, though, is identifying not what's easiest, but what's riskiest in the model. And that's what the prioritized step is. So if you just go and do all the easy stuff or relatively easy stuff, like build a product, which is fun for a lot of us product people, that may not be the riskiest step. So you want to prioritize what's riskiest, not what's easiest. And then this is where the fast iteration cycle or the experiment loop helps you to tell if your insights are right or not. the only metric that matters at the end of the day is traction. So it's not about anything else. It's not how big your team is, how much money you've raised. If you build something and you can attract customers who come, buy your product, use it, stay with you, that's ultimately what matters. So that's what we use to test if our models are working. If you aren't getting the requisite traction, it's time to go back and revisit the models. So this is just a one-page summary of what this process looks like. So these other mindsets here, as I said, I'm going to focus in on the first one particularly, but the other mindsets, if you scan through, are some tactical things that you can do on each of these steps. So when we think of models, we don't just think lean canvas, we think of a traction model. So how do you know whether you've got enough validation? How much validation is enough validation? The lean canvas helps you think through your business model. In the middle section here, there's a lot of prioritization steps. So thinking in terms of time being valuable, thinking in terms of risk use assumptions, thinking in terms of 10x. These are all mindsets that can help you in launching your product in a more systematic manner than the big bang approach of launch and see what happens. So these are all, again, mindsets that you will see in the Larry story that he employed that you don't see in the classic Steve type of a story. And then the last set of mindsets here are really a lot about good ways to run experiments. So you have to make evidence-based decisions. You can't test everything because unlike a scientist, scientists don't have infinite time, but you don't have a lifetime to go and build your business. You have a very small window of opportunity because no business model stays intact forever. So there's a very small window. If you look at all business models, there's going to be switching and disruption happening. So you have a small window to go really fast, uncover the right kinds of insights, and make the model work. And then as the customer behavior start to change, you have to change your models as well. And so that's what number 9 and number 10 are really about. So I mentioned a resource. If you are inclined to dive a little bit deeper, there is currently an online course that we have that you can check out. It just talks about these mindsets with some examples, with some case studies. If you're inclined, check that link. So that's the leanstack.com/foundations link that you see here. So I do want to dive next into what I consider the most important mindset. And this is the mindset of problems before solutions, and makes for a great bumper sticker. I'm actually wearing, if you can see, I'm wearing my Love the Problem t-shirt here today. So it makes for great t-shirts, makes for a great bumper sticker, but there are some inherent pitfalls. A very simple idea, start with problems, not solutions. But I want to share with you some of the common pitfalls people run into and some ways to potentially overcome that. So one of the ways to overcome it is to attempt to create a lean canvas. And logically, everyone typically gets the importance of problems. So if I show you this lean canvas, and if you've never seen this, just scan it and focus more on the boxes at the top. So problem, solution, customer segments. I think everyone can appreciate that if you build something that doesn't solve a problem for your customers, then no one's going to use it. If your customers don't get the problem, so they don't care about your solution, think about something you recently bought. Oftentimes it's because you wanted to achieve something or you wanted to get rid of some undesired situation in your life. That could be a problem, and that's why you bought something new. So if you don't solve for a problem, the solution doesn't matter. If the solution doesn't matter, your revenue streams don't matter, because why would anyone buy something that doesn't solve anything for them? Your unfair advantage, you may have a patent, you may have a lot of code, you may have a product built, but none of those things matter because customers don't care about them because they don't really solve a problem. So it's very easy to see how these two boxes are the pillars of your business model. If you don't have a strong foundation, the whole canvas comes crumbling down. So that's the logical way to see this. So most people will say, let me go and think of problems. Now, here's where the pitfalls start. So let's imagine, and I know that we are dealing with a younger audience today, but hopefully you all know what a CD is, and maybe some of you have heard of cassette tapes, maybe you've not all used them. So I could have moved this a little bit further in the timeline, but I had these slides and I was a little bit lazy. So we'll use cassettes and CDs, and hopefully we'll get the point across. But so CD, so if you had invented the CD, you could ask yourself, well, what problem did the CD solve? And you start making a list. Now, an engineer would probably come up with a list like this one. So a CD is digital versus analog. Why does that matter? Well, there's going to be better sound quality. Well, why is that the case? Because then I come up with a lot of these terms, which even I don't know what they mean. So twice the dynamic range, better frequency response, lower signal to noise ratio. So there are all these like tech jargon. And imagine trying to pitch this to a customer. Buy my CD because it gives you twice the dynamic range as whatever else you're using. People don't understand what that means. And so these are how a lot of pitches tend to sound, and they sound this way because they're very, very solution centric. They're full of a lot of this tech jargon and buzzwords that your customers maybe do not quite understand yet. This is what we call the innovator's bias. So when we are looking for problems, the challenge that many people run into, many innovators, entrepreneurs run into, is that they've already decided in their minds that they want to build this solution. They already want to build a hammer. And so when they go back to the lean canvas and they're asked to fill it out, they don't ask, what problems do my customers have that I can solve for them? They instead do this, which is, I've already built a hammer, or I want to build a hammer. What problems can I solve with a hammer for these customers? And so that becomes a very biased, a very skewed way of looking at things. And this is where we start justifying our solution using labels like problems to justify the thing we already want to build. And that's one of the traps we fall into. Now, this happens to everyone. So I'm not going to say don't do this because it will happen to everyone, but you want to catch yourself. And that's why this is such a tricky mindset, is that it will happen to us. We will see a problem, and we humans do not like problems. We want to quickly jump to solutions. Entrepreneurs are even more prone to jumping to solutions. So when that begins to happen, pause and use a mindset or use a first principle to ask yourself, what evidence do we have that this indeed is a problem? Can I go out there and search for evidence or do some discovery work? So that was that discovery slide in the previous slides there. But the other way to kind of work around this is something we call the innovator's gift. So the innovator's bias is falling in love with your solution and asking yourself, what can I solve with this thing I've already built? The innovator's gift is thinking outside the box. So basically saying, fine, I've got this hammer, but let me ask myself, what were people using before my hammer was invented? And what's broken with that? So it's a slightly different framing. And the big insight here is that new problems come from old solutions. They don't come from new problems you're going to invent. They come from things that get broken in the existing solution space. A very simple idea, but it allows you to go back to tools like the canvas and ask a very different question. So if you're familiar with the lean canvas, there is the problem box, and most people think that's the most important box. And I've been talking a lot about problems, but I will argue that the existing alternative box is even more important in the early stages. Because if you can identify the right existing alternatives that you are competing with, that people are using today, and you can find what's broken with them or what's wrong with them, that's where you're going to create problems that even your customers understand. So I'll illustrate this with an example. If you saw in my previous example, I had the CD and I was pitching a whole bunch of benefits, which maybe my early adopter customers understand, maybe the innovators understand, but the majority of the customers or the mainstream market do not understand what better quality means in music. If you put them in a room and played a cassette and a CD, they probably couldn't tell them apart. So that's not going to be the thing that makes them buy. So what you want to do if you are applying this is you want to ask yourself, how are people listening to music today? So you're thinking in this bigger context. So you have built a CD, it's going to be used for music, but what are people using today? At that time, when the CD was first introduced, the prevalent solution were cassette tapes. And so you could ask yourself, well, what problems not do CDs solve, but what problems do cassettes currently have? That is the key question to be asking. And now you make a very different list. And this is a list that you can sometimes not guess at. You actually have to go and observe people. You actually have to go and interview them. It's like, I'll give you an example that's more relevant. So think of, or more recent, I should say, think of Uber and ride sharing. If you had gone and asked people, what's the problem with taxis? People would have probably come up with some things, but they would have been maybe not as insightful. You have to go and do some discovery work to really uncover those pet peeves. And so if you look at what's broken with the cassette tape, and I recognize that many of you may not have used it, but one of the things that was a big pet peeve or a pain point is that cassettes were analog devices. They have this tape, and if you wanted to find a song, it could take you a few minutes to find a song. You had to forward and rewind and maybe reset your counters, and it's a pretty manual process. So pretty painful. So imagine you're at a party and you have got this new song that the host wants to play, but you have a cassette, and that's going to take you a few minutes to go and play. Meanwhile, your nemesis friend has a CD, and they rush to the party floor and say, "Play this," and push track number 7. Right? So you get this instant access of the song, and that in many ways could be the killer feature. That's what your customers really care about, not the better sound quality, not the capacity, not any of those types of things. Another pet peeve you might find is flipping cassettes. There's a side A and a side B. So the whole point here is that when you are looking for problems, go and study what people are currently using and search for things that are broken with those things. Don't come up with new things that you can potentially solve for them, because nobody cares about that. Now, to make this a bit more relevant, you can do this as an exercise. So this is essentially a brief intro on what outcome-driven thinking or jobs to be done type of thinking tends to look like. So the idea here is that we as a civilization, as humans, have listened to music for centuries. What has changed is not the goals we have. We all want to music. We all want to listen to music on our terms. Pick the songs, pick portable devices so we can take them with us, listen to them in better quality or high quality or stereo. All those things have always been there. What has changed is how the solutions have come and gone. And if you look at each of these switches, these are billion-dollar switches. They didn't switch because there was some new shiny object that looked like a donut, like the CD, that made us switch. It rather was something new came about that all of a sudden made us aware that what we have isn't good enough. And that is how consumers switch. So when MP3 came out, when the iPods came out, what Steve Jobs told us is, and not him, Napster also, is that we don't need to go and buy expensive CDs. We can instead download them initially for free, and then eventually for $1 at a time. We can put them on these portable iPods and carry them with us. 1,000 songs is all you need. And that caused a massive switch from CDs. And CDs began to have their own problems. They started to scratch. They were already skipping. If you have a Discman and you jump around with your CD, it's going to skip. MP3s don't skip. So all these things can be anchored in light of the current solution. Same thing with streaming services. Once you've got 1,000 songs in your pocket, that's great. But look at your friends. They have 40 million songs. They don't even own any of them. They are in the cloud. For one subscription fee, you can go to their house and they can play anything that's ever existed, or for all intensive purposes ever existed. And that's a superpower. Who doesn't want that, right? So you get rid of your MP3 player and instead sign up for a streaming service. And this story is going to change again. So the whole point of this, and that's what makes innovation so fun, is that I can predict with absolute certainty that in the next 10 years, maybe or less, we're going to have yet another way, yet another set of solutions. But how we, what that is going to be and how we get there is not going to be predicted based on some new tech that's coming out. It's going to be predicted on something that happens in the world, which now all of a sudden makes the old solution inferior to this new product. So how do you put this to practice? When you're looking at the lean canvas, a lot of people start in this order. So they might either start on the customer side or the problem side, but in their head, they are thinking, I have the solution. Who is my customer? What's my early adopter? What problems can I solve? And what existing alternatives do they have? Existing alternatives is always usually the fourth thing that goes through their mind. What I'm advocating is switching the ordering out around a little bit. And the subtle change can maybe have you look at your canvas very differently. So rather than starting in that order with your solution, ask a very different question. So I still like to start with customers. So figure out who your customer is. But when you're looking for early adopters, start to ask yourself, what has changed in their world? So customers don't buy anything unless there is something that's changing. So think of the pandemic. Once the pandemic happens, a lot of you, if you were going to school, would have gone to school in person. Today, that's not the case. So something changed there. If you work, you would have gone to work in person. Now you don't, and something changed there. Sometimes these changes are temporary. Sometimes they're long lasting. Sometimes they start temporary, but become long lasting because they're inherent benefits. But you want to be asking yourself, what are these triggering events that happen? Even new technology is an example of a triggering event. If I look at things that were not possible before, we're having a video conference here. We've got a lot of bandwidth. Some of us are on video. We couldn't do this 10, 15 years ago, but one day the technology enabled us to do that. And then you got a lot of startups saying, oh, we could act on this because the job is people want to meet and have immersive meetings in a remote fashion. And so they began to build these types of solutions. So look for what has changed. That's something that matters to your customers when they are switching between products, something that matters to your investors when they're investing in your idea because they want to understand what's different about you from all the other ideas they've seen that look very similar up until this point. The next most important thing is not jumping to problem even, jumping to the existing alternative box. So what are people doing today? How are early adopters solving this problem today? Don't just guess at this. You have to do some discovery work. You have to get outside the building. You have to go and see when people need to go to the airport, are they hiring taxis or are they using something else? When people are trying to get home after a Friday night of partying, are they hiring taxis or are they doing something else? So you have to go and discover these things. You can't just claim that you know these things by guessing. So the art here is figuring out not 10 different existing alternatives, but one or two that are the most prevalent ones. So in the music world, I talked about CDs and cassettes. There were probably other solutions out there like vinyl and gramophones and radio, but you're looking for which is the most prevalent one that you potentially might go after. And then the last piece here is asking yourself, so what's broken? So what's broken with the current way? And if that thing got broken because of some new change, that's even better for you. Because in the mind of the customer, they have realized that their old solution is no longer working and they are ready for something better. And this is where you can place your product in front of them and get the most meaningful conversation. You trying to trigger them, which also is an approach that people take, is not as effective. So if you go out there and say, I have a better solution and it's better because I say so, that's not going to work as well as if something has changed in the customer's world where they are seeking out those kinds of solutions. So I'm going to stop here content-wise, maybe get this piece out there and maybe open up for some questions that you might have.
Yeah, actually, I was logging all the questions that were coming in, so I can just throw those in as they came in through the chat. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Awesome. All righty. So the first question was, how is the model different for B2B versus B2C? So, and kind of approaching like the business modeling tool of Lean Canvas and just kind of maybe the mindsets.
Yeah. So the question I always like to ask is, if you have customers and if those customers have problems, then nothing I said is any different. So in the B2B world, it is much the same thing. The only differences is that people often forget that they sell to people. They often start thinking they sell to companies. So I sometimes see people saying, oh, I've got Apple as a customer, and that's great. But the thing you have to realize that within Apple, you generally have a customer who bought the product and maybe many users who are using the product you sold to Apple. And so when you shift away from selling to fictional, entities, or I would say entities like companies, to actual people, nothing else is different about it. So when you break down that process in the B2B world, it's a bit more complex because you have to figure out in the early days who is actually the person you're selling to. And sometimes you have customers and users and influencers, and that's why those sales become a bit more complex, but the mechanics are entirely the same. So in a B2C product, you may have a direct model where your user becomes your customer and it makes it a bit easier. In a Lean Canvas with a B2B, you might sometimes have to create a few more perspectives on the decision maker and the user, but that's generally the only difference that ultimately matters. You can apply much the same mindsets and techniques we talked about there.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Ash. The next question was for an e-commerce business, what are the types of demos that can be used to validate the idea?
For an e-commerce business, okay. And so e-commerce is a rather broad term. If I guess I can maybe come up with some with just some. I'll make up some examples here. The most important thing that you want to, from a demo perspective, the art of the demo is not training the other side. You're not trying to teach them how to use your e-commerce platform. All you need to do is communicate your unique value proposition, ideally with some proof, and that's what the demo is all about. And so if let's just use Shopify, because I think most people know Shopify. So if I look at Shopify, what they do is make it easy to create a e-commerce store. And now they do a lot of things, but in the beginning, it was just about putting the products you want to sell online, collecting payments, having a catalog, all those types of things. And so all I have to do in the demo is go to somebody who may be my potential customer. And these are not big companies. These are oftentimes, freelancers or people who are doing crafts at home and have a small store. So they don't have the know-how to put up a website, to do all these things, to come up with an e-commerce site. And so if you go to them in your demo and say, you want to put up a website, today you're doing this manually, you're getting faxes, you're getting emails, you're taking orders very manually. Imagine if you had an online presence, and then I can show a screenshot of what that looks like. I can then walk them through how easy it is to set up the store. 1, 2, 3 clicks and you're done. You start taking orders, grow your business. That's the end of the demo. So the art of the demo is show the before and after story. So if I was, again, demoing the CD, I wouldn't go in there and start talking about the dynamic sound and all those things I talked about. I'll just lose my customer. I instead say, imagine you want to find a song. How do you do that on a cassette tape? Imagine you want to find a CD. Let me show you. You push this button and the song starts playing. Tell me the next song you want to play, and I push that and it starts playing. Right. So you want to get that point across, get your UVP across in the demo, and that's the art of the demo. Is you want to figure out the smallest way to get that point across.
I love that. Thank you for that answer, Ash. The next question was, is number of users a good traction indicator even if you are pre-revenue?
Number of users, so that depends. So to me, number of customers is a way better indicator. And I make this distinction between users and customers. Users typically are free, they're not paying. Customers aren't. The only differences there is if you're building a multi-sided model, like say Facebook, in which case the more users you have, the more your likelihood to attract your true customer, which in their case is an advertiser. So in those cases, users matter. So to me, like I said, it depends on the business model type you have. But if you are building a direct model, so imagine I'm building a coffee shop and I only have users. People come into my coffee store every day and they smell the coffee but don't buy anything. That's not traction. To me, that's not a good business model because I've got a lot of people who come in there and they're just leaving. And so I want to make sure I can convert them. So you want to, ideally, traction to me is the rate at which you capture monetizable value. And sometimes that monetizable value is revenue you get from those coffee shop types of visitors. So they are actual customers. And sometimes if you're doing a multi-sided model, it can be a proxy for revenue. So if we know Facebook, for example, and all of you know Facebook, if their daily active users or Instagram's daily active users are going up, they can go to their investors and say we're growing, and everyone will believe them because more users mean more future revenue. So that's the key thing you're looking for in your traction metric. It needs to be a predictor of future revenue, not so much just raw users in your model.
Yeah, and I love that Facebook example because when I took your workshop, that one of the key terms that I pulled is the derivative asset, right? And so that's kind of where the users, what are they creating in terms of value to the customer, right? And so the more engaged users, the more ability they have to market down the line to, which is their end customer. So appreciate that. I love that example. So the next question is there an advantage for a business to create multiple variations of products to solve multiple problems?
Multiple variants. So in the early stages, when we look at this search versus execution challenge that we have, is we don't know what we don't know. You're going really fast. There are a lot of advantages to test even business models against each other. So in the early stages, that's something that we do highly recommend is if you just pick one model and make it super razor focused and go execute on it, it may actually work, which is good, but it may be a very small idea. There may be a much bigger mountain you could have just gone after, but you didn't because you were razor focused on a smaller opportunity. So that we call that in computer science, the local, or in mathematics, the local maxima trap. So when you're searching for things, we can easily fall into this local maximum and not miss the mountain for the hill. So a way to avoid that is definitely to start asking yourself, for this particular idea, are there multiple customer segments, and create models for each one? Or are there multiple problems, and go and create models for each one and do some testing for each one? And in the early stages, you can parallel test a lot of these things, but at some point you have to double down, especially when you start building your MVP and start rolling it out. It's very hard to then serve multiple masters. Masters or customers, you can't really deliver something and be focused when you are running through 2 or 3 models. So at that point, you have to double down on one. But think of A/B testing. You can A/B test traction across 2 or 3 different ideas and double down on the most pressing one. We see a lot of these in even accelerators like Y Combinator. One of the extreme startups I saw a case study on went through 30 ideas in 3 months. So they were a testing machine. Every week they would come up with 3 or 4 ideas and just start testing each one, and eventually found something that actually got quite a bit of traction.
Gotcha. Nice. So we have two more questions in the queue. The next one is, what if you are publishing a book? How would you market that? And I know you have a good example in Running Lean, which I would recommend checking out. Was a good example for me, but I'll have you obviously take it away.
Yeah. I am an engineer by background, so that's why I'm very much associated with the Steve character. So was very much of a builder, and for that reason, I use a lot of the tools, and in the book, there's a chapter in the book on how I wrote the book using every technique in the book. So it was obviously a chapter I came back and wrote, even though it's chapter 2 in the book. So that's something you can check out. There's even an online video, but the short of it is that think of what is the job of a book. So when I was writing my book, I realized that locking myself in the metaphorical garage and writing the book by myself was, 1, very lonely, and 2, very daunting, because what if I write a really terrible book? I had no idea. So I had to get out. And so the way that I devised a way to test my book is with workshops. I actually went out there and began teaching everything I was going to write about. And the fun thing is that I even got paid to do that. Initially, I ran the first workshop for free, and people said, why was this free? This was super valuable. I'm like, okay, I'll charge for the next one. And so I began to charge for all these workshops, and I used slides to actually define the content that would go in the book. And the nice thing with the workshop is you go and teach something like a Lean Canvas, and when people get confused and ask you a whole bunch of questions, those all become content for your book. Those are all things you can put in your book and address them. And then a year later, when you publish it, everyone says, wow, you read my mind because I had that question and you answered it. And that's the magic of this kind of a process, is you don't need to go and study 1,000 people, because there aren't 1,000 questions or 1,000 stories out there. After a while, like even today when I do workshops, I get some new questions, but I will be honest and say I get a lot of very similar sounding questions, because people are more alike than unalike. We generally, when we encounter something, we think very differently, so think very similarly. And so if you go and study that, even in small scale, it may only take 10, 20 workshops or conversations to really get a much better understanding of your readers, in my case, and write a way better book. So that was how I wrote the book. And there were a lot of like tactical stuff along the way in terms of testing, that in the case study, you can find some things that I did there to test various elements of the traction in the book and things like that.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great example to check out, especially if you are writing a book, because there'll be some good steps for you in going about doing so. So we have about 5 minutes left, and we'll stick it to these last 2 questions. So after completing the 1, 2, 3, 4, which was kind of the leaner canvas that you put together in your last slide, what's the next steps to do as it from a Larry's mindset or entrepreneur's perspective?
Yeah, so it's taking stock of these things. And oftentimes when we initially do these models, so think again in that scientific approach, it's perfectly okay to guess. Richard Feynman is famous for, when asked how do scientists come up with ideas, he says, well, they just guess in the beginning. So perfectly okay to guess. The mistake too many people make is they turn those guesses into actual beliefs and then start executing. So once you create these models, at this point, you're creating a story. Does the story make sense? When this change happens, this product breaks, these are the problems. Does that make sense? So you want to look at it at a logical level. But the next best thing is to then get outside the building and start interviewing people. So if I was looking at the CD, I don't go pitch the CD. I just want to understand, when people are at a party and they want to, play music with cassettes, what does that process look like? So go and interview some people and see how are they managing with that situation. And if you see struggle, if you see a lot of frustration, that's good news for you, because you can then in a subsequent meeting go to them and say, in your next party, just use CDs, don't use cassettes. Same thing with the ride sharing example. When people order a taxi, what does that workflow or process look like? Go and study that. And if the problems that you see there match up with your Lean Canvas, pat yourself on the back and then go pitch them. But if you learn something new, then come back and update the Lean Canvas and then fix your offer and then go pitch that.
Awesome. So our final question, and drawing it to a close, was, in your test prioritize model slide, what does the 10X mean?
Yeah. So this again is a trick that we use, and this was actually more in the mindset. So the idea of 10x. So too many startups when they launch, they do a big public launch, and you can see a pattern over and over again. If you look at Facebook, they didn't launch to everyone. They launched in just one school, and then 3 schools, and then 10 schools. And this is this idea of 10x, or giving yourself permission to scale. And the reason that it works is that when you launch to everyone, you typically have to deal with a lot of risks up front. You may, in a good case, have lots of users and they start, bombarding you with questions. Not all those users are customers. And so you've got a customer service problem. You sometimes have a scalability problem. There are only 2 of you or 3 of you. You have a people problem. How do you really manage all this much noise? And so the idea of 10x is really saying, let's flip this. So instead of you being played by the hockey stick, you want to play the hockey stick curve. And so give yourself permission to scale. So give yourself permission to only start with maybe your first 10 customers and just make that happen. And if you can come back in a week and say, done, good news, pat yourself on the back, but now level up to 100 customers. That's the idea of 10x. So the hockey stick is nonlinear. You need to think nonlinearly. But when you do those kind of jumps from 1 customer to 10 to 100, it allows you to more systematically identify what are those bottlenecks or constraints in your model that you should be focused on. And we teach this mindset. It's the tackle your riskiest assumption. You can more easily identify what's riskiest. For a lot of people, they worry about branding and logos and scaling risk. But I would guarantee your first 10 customers don't even care what your company is named. They just care if you're solving a problem or not. Now, by the time you solve your 1,000 company, like same thing with my book. My book cover, I didn't have a book cover when I sold my first 100 copies because my early adopters didn't care. But I can guarantee that now in the bookstore, when people look at my book, they are going to judge it by its cover. So that becomes important at scale, but doesn't become important in the early days. So that 10x allows you to trade the right kinds of risks at the right time instead of just trying to do everything and overwhelming yourself.
Definitely. No, and I love how that ties to the minimum success criteria, and working backwards was a key learning for me. So like, where does that revenue goal you want to work towards? And if you actually give yourself the permission to 10x, it's, technically kind of easier on the front end, right? Instead of having, a bunch of customers up front, you give yourself that opportunity to actually grow into that hockey stick. But drawing it to a close, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Ash, and sharing your experience and expertise. What a wonderful session, and a treat for our ecosystem to learn from you. We definitely will share some resources in terms of how to, learn more about your books, as well as the leanstack.com platform. But just wanted to say thank you again for being in our community. This is, a full week of events. So this is only day 2. We have 2 more events today. Actually, we have 3 more events taking place today. So I'm putting in the chat, we have the Global Entrepreneurship Week website. So definitely go and check that out. It's a great way to check out the rest of the events. And thank you again, Ash, and we'll draw it to a close. And have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we can see you the rest of the week.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was nice to see everyone, and all of you take care.
All righty, thank you.